Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. To all those watching live on Zoom, to all those watching live on YouTube, a very warm welcome from everybody here tonight on behalf of Rabbi Feldman, Rabbi Levine, and Rabbi Fine, bringing together Bushy, Belmont, and Stanmore, the very finest that we have to offer in these parts of the world. It is a huge pleasure to have you all joining us this evening for the first of 3 sessions that we will run to mark the 3 weeks, which we will be starting tomorrow. The 17th of Tammuz will be tomorrow, and it's only 3 weeks to go till Tisha B'Av. It's going to be a very interesting time of year for everybody. Even for those who are able to make it to shul, it's really not going to look the same. And please God, these sessions will give us all a little bit of inspiration, inject a little bit of meaning into what this time period means, and hopefully we can make the most of it given the circumstances that we find ourselves in this year. It's quite remarkable, really, if we think about it. Over 2,000 years ago, the Jewish people would have had to adjust to life without the Beit HaMikdash, without the temple as their center point of their Jewish life. And we find ourselves all these years later having to make our own adjustments. And perhaps for some, this year is really going to be a very meaningful and very poignant 3 weeks period. And please God, we should take this opportunity, take this time to work on all of the things that we need to work on. Even though we are not necessarily able to be in shul the way we would like, we can nonetheless find the ways of marking these times, marking these days in our homes. And so to start us off, we are honored and privileged to welcome Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, who is just one of the most fantastic educators that we have. And so it's an immense privilege to have him with us this evening to start our 3 weeks for 3 communities program. For those of you who don't know Rabbi Aubrey Hersh, he has been teaching in the UK for over 20 years, primarily with the JLE in Golders Green. And more recently, over the last 10 years, I believe has led over 50 trips, heritage tours to different parts of Europe. So let's just say he knows his stuff when it comes to history. And so without further ado, I'm very honored to be able to hand the digital floor over to Rabbi Hirsch.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to all of you from a virtual distance. I was hoping that during the 9 hours that we've now got for this lecture, we could go through some of the books behind me, because obviously I understand, as has just been said, that I'm dealing with the finest here and you've got staying power. So hang on in there. It'll be a ride, and hopefully you will all be there when we get to the other end. So I've been asked to speak about the history that surrounds the fall of Jerusalem. And obviously this is 2 stories, because there were 2 temples destroyed, and on both occasions the walls of Jerusalem were breached in the run-up to the actual destruction of the temple itself within a few weeks, either on the 17th on both occasions, 17th of Tammuz in the Hebrew calendar on both occasions, or potentially in the case of the first temple a week earlier. But either way, we are definitely in that period which led to the tragic circumstances of exile, not once, but twice. Now, in order to properly understand the context of what was going on, I will try and run you through about maybe 800-900 years of history over the next couple of minutes, and then expand into the specific events that surround Jerusalem. The Jews enter into the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua and conquer and divide the country and settle there. And they will spend the next 400 years living there without a temple, but this being their homeland, this being the place that they consider as theirs. And 400 years is a rather large amount of time in history if you consider, for instance, that the Jews in England have not been here for that length of time since their readmittance under Oliver Cromwell. And therefore, we can view the Jews at the time as being very residential. This is home. And there are various powers in the vicinity, whether it be the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, but these are localized powers. This will change dramatically under the Assyrian Empire, which will not just be the new kid on the block, but an empire building kid. There's always one. There's always somebody who's got aspirations of grandeur. And in this case, it was Sancherib, whose capital city was Nineveh on the Tigris River. And his city, in fact, was the largest in the world for about a half a century. And he not only conquers the immediate surrounding area, Assyria is located to the east of Israel. It is his capital city was within the confines of Iraq, but it spread over northwards towards Iran as well. And he will invade the land of Israel. The greatest change that will take place is the removal of 10 of the tribes into exile. The Jewish people at that stage were themselves somewhat divided. There were two kingdoms, as it's referred to historically. The kingdom which surrounded Jerusalem itself and had many of the priests, the Levites, the tribe of Judah and of Benjamin. And then there were the other tribes whose headquarters was in Samaria, and they will be exiled by Sancherib, and that will take place around 140 years before the destruction of the first temple. But the way it works in empire building is you never stay at the top for very long. Eventually, somebody will come along and topple you from your perch, from your position. And in this case, it was Nebuchadnezzar. And the interesting thing about both of these individuals is that we have archaeological history that tells us about the individuals. So for instance, if you've ever been into the British Museum, you will find a room on the ground floor dedicated to what's called the Lachish reliefs. This is from Sancherib's palace in Ashur, in Assyria. And he defeated the Jews and created an entire memorial, obviously carved in stone, to remind everybody who exactly he was and what exactly he could achieve. And you can see the king on his throne. You can see various elements of his victory quite clearly there. And the British Museum has one entire room of the stone reliefs, which they sort of, shall we say, fingered, lifted from Assyria when they were there on occasion in the 19th century. The palace still stands in Assyria, in Iraq, but this entire historical picture is now contained within the British Museum. What is missing from Sancherib's story is the siege, not against the second largest city, which was Lachish, but against the largest, which was Jerusalem. And there, Sancherib fails. he loses an enormous amount of men, 185,000 soldiers, retreats to Assyria, is murdered by both of his sons, the price of failure in the ancient world, and eventually the Assyrian Empire goes into decline until, as I mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar picks up the baton. Now, originally, he will simply take over the Assyrian Empire as it stands, but eventually he will expand upon it, and he will move his capital city to Babylon, also on a river, and he will rename the empire Babylonia, or Bavel, as it is referred to in the Talmud and in Jewish texts. All empires, in order to survive, need various critical ingredients. They require commerce, because if there isn't enough money flowing into the country, the people will depose those who are at the top. It requires water, in a way more than food, water both for transport and to irrigate. It is a staple of life back then, and therefore all empires were founded on waterways, generally on major routes of water transport. An empire requires governance, because it is being run by a very small amount of people who are controlling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people. So commerce, governance, water. It also requires weak enemies, because the moment you have somebody else who is gearing up to take over, you're going to be expending an enormous amount of money and manpower just in controlling your borders. And finally, empires need to thrive. There needs to be expansion. One of these, if not more, will always come to an end, and that signifies the end of your empire. So for instance, if you take the Roman Empire, governance was probably its main failing, because it became corrupt. They took life easy, and easy enough that the Vandals from the north, and without going into the history of the Roman Empire, their existence came to an end generally because of governance. In the case of commerce, it can come to an end because of inventions that other countries are able to bring to the marketplace, and therefore they will become dominant. And in the case of Babylonia, they therefore needed expansion. They had commerce, they had water, they had governance, and they needed to expand. And at the time they had, except for one enemy that we'll come to in a moment, which is very relevant to the Jewish people, they had essentially weak enemies surrounding them. So they expand into the land of Israel. Now, bearing in mind, of course, at the time, as we mentioned, 10 of the tribes are no longer there. What the Assyrians had done, the previous empire, what they had done is replaced the 10 empires, the 10 tribes, with people from other countries, including those that would become known as the Samaritans, because they lived in the region of Samaria, and they would cause tremendous problems for the Jewish people, especially at the beginning of the Second Temple, but in a way for the first couple of hundred years. It is not by chance or by accident that the parable in the New Testament refers to the Good Samaritan. This is more than a dig, it's actually an attack on the infrastructure of Jewish hierarchy, which Jesus was making. So he goes to the priest first and then the Levite, and no one's prepared to help him until he comes across the Good Samaritan. The Samaritans were anything but good, as Jesus was fully aware when he was creating the narrative. But they are brought to live in the land of Israel from Africa in order to populate a country, because you don't want the country and the countryside empty. It will become overgrown, it will become fallow, you're losing out on agricultural possibilities. And therefore, when Nebuchadnezzar, the head of the Babylonian Empire, expands into the land of Israel, he's not really going to meet much resistance from any of these newly brought tribes into that country. They haven't got an infrastructure, they haven't got an army, they are just there manning the land, tilling the land, if you will. But he still has to deal with those two remaining tribes, and he will besiege and eventually conquer Jerusalem, something that his predecessor was unable to do. However, his occupation for the next 20 years, until the temple is destroyed, or for the next 18 years, will be relatively benign. In other words, even though this is now part of the empire, he does not dismantle it, nor is there a brutal occupation. And this is very different to what will occur in Roman times. When the Romans occupy the land of Israel, the occupation is defined as very brutal. And therefore, if you look in the Talmud at the contrast between the beginnings of the Babylonian exile and the Roman exile, they are termed very differently. And the Babylonians themselves are viewed in a very different light. The Romans get a pretty bad press. I suppose it is then given expression in the life of Brian when everybody asks, what have they ever done for us? But this is mentioned already in the Talmud in a slightly different vein. Be that as it may, I mentioned that there's only one enemy that Babylonia has, that is a cause of any level of concern, and that is Egypt. Now, the Egypt of old was destroyed, rebuilt, and now they are in ascendancy at this period of time, and we are around 2,500 years ago from today. Of course, by Babylonia conquering the land of Israel, they are now neighbors to this aspiring empire, and it creates friction. It does not only create friction between Babylonia and Egypt, but between the Jews, these 2.5 tribes, and Egypt, because the Jews are toying with the idea constantly over the next 15 years or so, whether they should throw in their lot with Egypt and mount a successful rebellion against Babylonia. It doesn't come from nowhere. The fact that the Jews will bring about a series of events that will culminate in the destruction of the temple doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of the fact that there is a neighboring country who they are looking to for support. As it will turn out, they will be bitterly disappointed in this support. And if we look in various of the prophecies in Jeremiah, in Isaiah, we will see the warnings given by the Nevi'im, by the prophets, to the especially the monarchy, but the people of Judea as a whole, telling them not to trust in Egypt. Unfortunately, this warning was not always heeded. So the Babylonians are in place, a pretty benign occupation. But there's always a tax that comes with occupation, and therefore they will take from the temple treasury much of the wealth that Judea has. And 9 years later, this is 11 years before the destruction of the temple, they will actually remove many of the leaders from Judea, including the person who at the time was the king. There will still be another king that replaces him, but the ruling king at the time will be taken from Judea and led into exile, and in fact die outside of the land of Israel. It is an event which we refer to in Esther, in the scroll of Megillat Esther that we read on Purim. We, at one stage, move into a mournful tune when we have just introduced Mordechai in the second chapter, and we describe the reason that he ended up out of the land of Israel. Hogla im hagoyla, he was exiled with the exile of Yechoniah, Melech Yehuda. Yechoniah, who was the king of the Jews, he was taken into exile. Now, although this will be seen as a tragedy clearly at the time, it will actually be the saving grace of the Jewish people, because the transference of so many leaders, of so many capable people from the land of Israel to Bavel will allow these leaders to set up an infrastructure such that when the rest of the Jewish people will arrive in exile 11 years later, there is sufficient ability, sufficient infrastructure for Jewish life to continue in Bavel. If you want to contrast this with something much closer to our times, the USA would be a case in point. The Jews came to the USA, millions of them, but there was absolutely no Jewish, definitely no religious infrastructure in place. Not much of a charitable Jewish infrastructure, but no religious infrastructure. And it wasn't just that the United States was a desert. In fact, it was worse than that, because people set up shop on their own and they said, yeah, I'm a rabbi. I can marry you, divorce you, I can do shechita. And it was utter anarchy in the United States beyond the 19th century, well into the 20th century, the first 3 decades of the 20th century, until there was some form of regulation. If you contrast this, let's say, for instance, with England, where because there was a chief rabbinate, so marriage and divorce went through a central authority. They weren't able to necessarily control kashrut, definitely not initially, but there was some level of infrastructure in place. And as a result, going back to Bavel, of these leaders being brought into exile early, they were able to ensure continuity. And we always, when talking of destruction, have to understand what happened next. Often the texts that we will read, whether it's the Megillah, the scroll of Exile that we read on Tisha B'Av, or the Kinnos, the Lamentations that we read during the day of Tisha B'Av, they will describe the destruction. They won't tell us what happens next. And therefore, we need to understand, where did we go with exile? What did we manage to do with the new status quo? So this is what happens with regards to Babylonia. Now, by the way, 2 things change when the Babylonians come into power, and we find them both, once again, in the Megillah of Esther, in this scroll, which has little bits of history thrown in, which to the discerning ear, which you've now all become as a result of this, you will be attuned to next time you hear it being read. For instance, the months of the Jewish calendar. In the Chumash and in the early books of Nach, in other words, the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, dates, months, always numbers. The 15th day of the first month, the 10th day of the 7th month. They don't have names. Those names that we have now in our Jewish calendar are picked up through the Babylonian exile. The second thing that happens is that we normally are referred to as Bnei Yisrael, which we will now translate as the Jewish people, but that's not a precise translation. The Bnei Yisrael should be the children of Israel. We are always referred to as Bnei Yisrael in the early books of Nach, but not in later years and not in the Megillah of Esther. We are then called Yehudim, and that much more closely approximates Jews. That's where the term comes from. And you will know one of the 4 verses that we read aloud in Megillas Esther is La Yehudim Haisa'era v'simcha. The Jews rejoiced, not Bnei Yisrael, because the other tribes are gone. You only have basically Yehuda. They are the dominant tribe. They are the majority tribe. So these changes will take place, and we are called Jews as a result. That dates back to what is going on there. Now, as I say, during these 20 years of occupation by the Babylonians, the Jews will constantly flirt with the idea of getting into alliance with the Egyptians. They will do so once, it will be put down, it will be a disaster. 9 years before the temple is destroyed, the king Tzidkiyahu will once again make a break for independence. Right, you try keeping Jews down, and it's not the type of thing that works well. Especially, we have to bear in mind that at the time, the Jews have lived in the country for 840 years. They have always been independent since almost the beginnings of their existence. They came out of Egypt, spent 40 years in the desert, 840 years in the land of Israel. They've only known independence. We, on the other hand, have only known dependence. We are always a minority in somebody else's host nation. So you have to realize that the mindset was very different at the time. We have to view things from that perspective. So they will make sort of a break for the border. They will make a run for freedom. And Nebuchadnezzar himself, the head of the Babylonian Empire, will raise a siege against Jerusalem. This siege will start 2.5 years before the walls of Jerusalem are actually breached. From a Jewish perspective, it is the year 3336, right? We are now 5780, so we are talking some 2,450 years ago. Now, the date that the siege commences is in the Jewish calendar, the 10th of Tevet. It is a fast day. The reason it is a fast day is because it's the beginning of the end. From here on, exile will be part and parcel of what the Jewish people will live through. And even during the Second Temple was always temporary in comparison to the first. And therefore, we don't have a 10th Tevet equivalent for the Second Temple. You didn't need one. From that date in the First Temple, our independence was simply a ticking clock until it would disappear. And it took, in this case, 2.5 years. 2.5 years later, in the month of Tammuz of the year 3338, the walls of Jerusalem will be breached. And this will lead to the collapse of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is obviously a heavily fortified city. If you've ever taken tours of Ir David or of the areas surrounding the temple itself, you will see the fortifications that existed. The wall, if you're in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and you will come across fortifications which date back 2,500 years to the Jerusalem of old. It was smaller than it would become during the Second Temple, but nevertheless, we can pretty much map out the geography. Now, what then takes place, Jerusalem falls, and eventually, a few weeks later, the temple is destroyed. What happens, though, is unusual. Due to the Jews' drive for independence, rather than simply being subdued, as general nations were in the ancient world, instead, we are actually removed almost lock, stock, and barrel and taken from the land of Israel and moved to Bavel, moved to Babylonia. Now, normally, that would be the death sentence. Nations don't recover from that. They either perish or they assimilate, but they don't maintain identity. Now, once again, for us, being a Jew in a country which the majority is not Jewish is the norm. But for them, it was the first time, and the understanding was that they would cease to be. They will not survive this. They will not recover from this. And therefore, we have to view Jewish survival, which we somewhat take for granted, as not just unusual, but going against all the laws of history. It doesn't work that way. Beyond the fact that in the second temple, when we are exiled, we're literally scattered all over the world. That's a further level of miracle to our survival. But even in the first temple, being completely removed from your soil, uprooting the trees and moving them to locations hundreds of miles away would normally spell the death. For them, it didn't. But they did have to cope with exile. That's where they now find themselves. They will spend the next 70 years in exile. But as far as empire building is concerned and kids on the block, we started with Assyria, who begins the fashion. Babylonia takes it up. Eventually, Persia becomes the dominant empire. In the famous painting of Rembrandt, Belshazzar's Feast, you have literally the writing on the wall, an expression that has now become part of the English language. A hand appears and basically foretells the destruction, total destruction of the Babylonian Empire, and they will be taken over by a merger of the Persians and the Medes, who are slightly north geographically of Babylonia, and they will overrun the entire empire. Now, what then happens to the Jewish people is that the Persians will allow the Jews back to the land of Israel. After a while, after the Purim story takes place between the first and the second temple while they are in exile. A good question to ask people: which happened first, Purim or Hanukkah? So since Hanukkah happened under the Greeks, it must have happened second, but people who are not acquainted enough with the history will hesitate and they might guess wrong. You now know this, so not only have we given you fact, we've given you party facts as well. I note there are not a lot of people taking notes, but I assume you're relying on the recording, which will be sent to you in order to make sure that you don't miss a beat at the end of this. Either way, we still have 8.5 hours to go, so it might be that you're just pacing yourself. That could very well be. I have noticed that with other groups, generally groups that have never invited me back to speak, which I've not understood because I've got much more than just the 9 hours to give over. I guess I put it down to conflicts in scheduling or something along those lines. Either way, coming back to the matter at hand, I don't have enough, so I've got to fill. I don't have somebody with me to feed me lines. So I've just got to keep on going. So the Persians will allow the Jews back. After what has been a 70-year exile, they will allow them to come back to the land of Israel. But here is something which is also very unusual. The vast majority of Jews do not go back. They remain in Babylonia. And in fact, there will be a Jewish presence in Bavel for 2,500 years, right up until somewhere between 1948 and the 1950s, when the Jews will feel very unwelcome in these Arab countries in which they have lived for millennia. But until then, there will be a Jewish presence throughout. And you have grave sites of some of the Nevi'im, of some of the prophets. The prophet Ezekiel, Yecheskel Hanavi, is buried in Bavel, because this is a real place of Jewish presence, of Jewish existence for centuries. And the vast majority of Jews will stay. It is only a small amount that come back, which is why the borders during the Second Temple period of Jewish presents will be much smaller than those of the first temple. However, the Jews, of course, are grateful to the Persians for having let them come back in, and there is an attempted invasion of the Persian Empire by none other than the Greeks, the new kid, Alexander the Great. This is 40 years into the Second Temple period. The Jews will back the Persians, and this is another facet of history which needs to be understood for what it is, and that is that Jews often had to make choices as to which of the two warring empires or warring countries to go with. Sometimes it was a question of warring individuals. They had to make a choice, and you were operating on limited knowledge, on instinct, on the various bits and pieces, which of course were not infallible. In this case, the Jews backed the Persians for understandable reasons. It's quite a benevolent occupation, and they lose. What you would then expect to take place is the destruction of the Second Temple. And indeed, it's something that the Samaritans push for quite strongly. But in a story that we do not have time to go into now, we'll come back to it in the second hour of our show tonight. So that disaster was averted by the fact that Shimon HaTzadik, who is the high priest and the leading sage of the Jewish people, will meet Alexander the Great, and to put it mildly, they hit it off, and therefore Alexander the Great calls off the dogs of war long before Shakespeare came up with the term, and the temple is saved. It could have been destroyed 40 years after it was built. However, once again, a big change between the first temple and the second temple. The first temple is there, as we described, because in the times of Joshua, they conquered the land and they were there for almost 1,000 years. The second temple exists because the Jews are allowed to be there on sufferance. The Persians allowed them, and luckily enough, so to speak, the Greeks allowed them. But they are there on somebody else's say-so. They no longer have independence. They no longer have a monarchy. They no longer have prophecy. Their leadership is difficult to maintain because much of the infrastructure has been removed. And there are tremendous parallels with what takes place in 1948, because the country that comes into existence, it didn't have the name Israel yet. It was nameless at the time. But the country that was given to the Jews, the land that was given to the Jews in 1948, or I suppose more correctly, on the 29th of November 1947, was by grace of the other nations. Even though it was a land that was ours, it was a land that was given to us by the UN. And many of the issues that have existed since then come about because of that. Right, the United Nations Resolution 248, the one about 248 rather, the one about the borders of the land. And which other country has the UN defining what is and isn't theirs, especially when they have enemies around them that are trying to destroy them and that are actively calling up the troops? But Israel, unfortunately, has oversight by the UN on what it can and can't do. So yes, it is independent in the sense that it's got its own flag and its own country and its own government, but not necessarily its own governance. And that is something, when I mentioned that the first temple already speaks of exile, this element of exile was never reversed even when they had a second temple. It was not fully theirs. They never regained that bit, which is why, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the 10th of Tevet is the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the end that we want to see completely reversed, and we've only at the moment seen partially reversed. The Greeks control the Jews for the next 150 years. And then the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, come into play for reasons, once again, we're not going to go into, but they they fight against the Greeks, and they are somewhat successful in doing so. Unfortunately, with success comes power, because it's the Hashmonaim, it's the Hasmoneans who are now in charge. They will become the most corrupt element of the Jewish people, and they will become non-religious and interested in maintaining their grip of power over the land of Israel. They will initiate 2 civil wars. I don't mean 2 wars against non-Jewish nations, but within Judea, there will be 2 wars fought of Jew against Jew that will be brought about through the Hashmonaim, through the Hasmoneans, through the later dynasties. And I remember I was teaching in Hasmonean, this is 25 years ago, and Rabbi Beryl Wine, the historian, spoke there to the 6th form, and a precocious 6th form student asked him the question, is Hasmonean a good name for a school? To which, without missing a beat, he responded, it depends. Are you one of the earlier Hasmoneans or the later Hasmoneans? Because the earlier Hasmoneans sacrificed their lives for the Jewish people, for Judaism, and for the temple. The later Hasmoneans reversed all of those gains and turned them into losses. It is, however, the second of those civil wars that we need particularly to be aware of, because the second one came about when 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, who were of the Hasmonean dynasty, sons of Yanai, King Yanai Hamelech, fought a civil war around Jerusalem. One brother was inside and in a fortress, and one was on the outside. These 2 were the sons, as I mentioned, of Yanai Hamelech and also of Shlomtzion Hamalka. If you ever have been to the end of Rehov Yafa, just as you're coming towards the old city, you will know that one of the streets is Shlomtzion Hamalka. In fact, armed with some of the facts and some of the names I've just given you, you can take a more educational tour of these streets. And if you get lost, you won't worry, because just look up at the street sign and there is another historical fact for you. In the 3rd hour of our talk tonight, we will be dealing with one of the districts in Jerusalem. So at that stage, we will perhaps have a photo montage. Maybe I'll have to share the screen. Either way, there is a civil war taking place between 2 brothers. Jews are killing Jews. And it is pretty much a stalemate. And therefore, they decide to bring about, this is in 63 BCE, 130 years before the temple will be destroyed. They bring somebody in to arbitrate their dispute, to decide who's right and who's wrong. Who do they bring in 63 BCE? The newly emerged kid on the block, Rome, Pompey, no less. A general who will become, within a couple of years, part of the ruling triumvirate, along with Julius Caesar and Cassius. He will be one of the 3. He is the most successful Roman general, and they bring him into Israel, into Judea, to arbitrate the dispute. He decides for one brother against the other, and then further decides, but now that I'm here, you know something? I'm going to stay. When the Romans took over the land of Israel, they did so without firing a shot. The Greeks had to fight for it. The Babylonians had to fight for it, not so the Romans. The Romans came about because of Jewish power struggles, because of Jewish stupidity, and because of Jewish short-term vision. So if you think that, you know, the writing of poisoned letters into the JC denotes a lack of unity, a lack of achdus amongst the Jewish people, go back some 2,000 years. And we now have further insights into the understanding of the Second Temple being destroyed because of what's called sinat chinam, baseless hatred. We don't just mean they didn't get on. We mean that there were fractures in society which went all the way through. And the Romans will now occupy the land of Israel, and they will be there until the temple is destroyed. And their occupation, well, it will range. I mean, initially under Augustus and under Tiberius, who between them reigned for quite a period of time, probably some 45 years between them, will be okay at times. Unfortunately, the Romans will elect over the Jews what they will term a king of the Jews, Herod, who was anything but a king of the Jews. He wasn't Jewish. And him and his son Archelaus, who's even worse, will terrorize the Jewish people to the extent that the Jews go to Rome to complain about Archelaus, about Herod's son, and he is shipped off to France, to Gaul, because the Jews can't cope with him. That's how difficult the times are. Interestingly, it will also be a time where there are a lot of conversions to Judaism. From an individual perspective, this is the period of Hillel and Shammai. And this is the time where individuals are looking around at the brutality of the Roman Empire and saying, there's got to be something more than this. And as individuals, they will convert. But as a whole, Roman society will be dominant and will be numerically superior, and they will have their headquarters in Caesarea. There is a statement in the Talmud that either Jerusalem or Caesarea can be built, but you can't have them both properly built up, because one denotes the Roman occupation and one is Jewish independence or some level of independence. And we can therefore understand how tempers are frayed in and around Jerusalem, because the Romans are occupying in either an offhand manner or a particularly brutal manner. And after Tiberius will come Caligula, who is mad, I guess that's the best way to put it. Then you have Claudius. There are enough of you, by the looks of things, on screen at the moment who will remember I, Claudius, the series that we all watched back in probably the late 70s, maybe the early 80s. And you have this guy who becomes the emperor, who stutters, but basically they'd killed everybody else. They just wiped out so many other members of the family, because as soon as you became the Roman emperor, the first thing you did is you wiped out your whole family, because you didn't want anybody else to take it over. But what you can understand is, and when I mentioned earlier that the Roman Empire will collapse for a lack of governance, you can already see it now. The Republic becomes an empire under Julius Caesar. Then you get Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, and then Nero in the year of the 4 emperors. But either way, you have an occupation which is very trying to the Jewish people. And there are highwaymen on bandits between cities. There will be an attempt to free themselves of Jewish rule. Josephus, who becomes the historian living under the Romans, was originally a Jewish general in the Galil. I don't know if you've taken tours of the area where he mounted his rebellion. You can still see enough archaeological sites to understand, if you've got a decent tour guide that is, to understand what you're looking at and to understand what they attempted to do. But they do that around the time of Jesus's death, around the time of 30 CE. It fails miserably because the Romans cannot afford to allow any single part of their empire to go independent. for the simple reason that they don't have many troops. They are spread out all the way. I mean, by now they're in Britain and they're in Asia and they're in Africa. They don't have enough soldiers to keep things under control. And therefore what they have to do, if any rebellion takes place, they have to brutally put it down, because otherwise it's the end of the empire. Right? There's of course one exception to this, and the exception is a little village in Gaul where Asterix lives, because they managed to maintain their independence even though there are 4 Roman legions around. You might have to do some repetition, because during the 4th hour of tonight's talk, we will be talking about Asterix and the Romans and how close that is to actual history. So I will have some pages which I've scanned in, which I can share the screen on, but the rest you are going to have to get to your libraries and open those well-thumbed copies of Asterix and the Romans in order to get perspective on the 4th hour this evening. But back to the ranch. I haven't taken my pills this evening, so this could really go on for quite a while. So the Romans, therefore, are occupying the land of Israel, at times quite brutally, and the Jews are now essentially split into 3 factions. There are the zealots that are pushing for rebellion. There are those that are quite assimilated and are pushing with ever more control by the Romans of Judea. And then there are the sages who are trying to navigate some pathway between the 2 extremes. And every so often they are telling this group, this is, disastrous, and then they're telling it to that group. And it's very difficult, especially, as I say, there isn't a monarchy anymore. There isn't prophecy. And therefore, the leadership is on much weaker ground than it would have been during the First Temple period. And eventually, another rebellion breaks out in the 60s of the, I guess the first millennium. So in the year around 66 CE, we have the revolt against Rome, with its headquarters being in Jerusalem, because by this time the Galil is now no longer a Jewish area to some degree. Tiberias is a very Roman city, as its name suggests. And therefore the main part of the rebellion now, 4 years before the temple will be destroyed, is in the middle of the land of Israel. And what the Romans do is they take their time. They pick off the towns one by one around Jerusalem. And they wait for Jerusalem to collapse under siege conditions. They will eventually bring 3 legions to fight Jerusalem: the 5th Battalion, the 9th, and the 10th. One of those 3 was actually in Britain. They schlepped them 2,000 miles to do battle against the Jews, because it wasn't an easy war. It wasn't something that the Romans took for granted. If you ever walk into the old city through Shari-Jaffa, through the Jaffa Gate, so the first thing you see is an Ottoman tomb, and then there are 2 hotels, one next to the other. Those 2 hotels used to be Jewishly owned. In fact, it used to be where some of the great Jews of the 19th century stayed. Rav Kook stayed there at one stage, and various other dignitaries. They used to make weddings on the roof. I think it's the Petra Hotel, and it very recently has come back into Jewish hands, literally in the last month. But between those 2 hotels, there's a little alleyway, and somebody has an ice cream shop there, and they are advertising their wares on top of a stone plinth. That stone plinth belongs to the 10th Roman Legion. So next time you walk through Shariafa, and hopefully it won't be too long, you will take note of the history of the siege of Jerusalem, a visible memento, visible reminder thereof. These three factions, the Zealots, the Sages, and the pro-Roman party, are all living within the walls of Jerusalem and fighting amongst themselves. And eventually the Romans will start the siege of Jerusalem. They have catapults, they have various machines which allow them to break down whatever fortifications come their way. And therefore it's only a matter of time. If you take a tour of the old city, you will see the upper city and the lower city. The upper city was more assimilated. Right, that's where the pro-Roman faction was. The lower city was both more religious and more zealot. They had a combination of both there. But it's a matter of time, and eventually Jerusalem, the upper city falls, and then the lower city, and then the temple itself is destroyed. And as we mentioned, not only will the Jews be taken into exile, but they will be dispersed. They will be spread out all over the place. There will be a coin that the Romans mint to celebrate their achievement. They don't do this when they conquer Gaul or when they conquer Helvetica or any of the other European countries, but they do so when they conquer Israel because it was so tough. Judea Capta is the inscription on one side, and they change the name of Jerusalem and they erect a pagan temple to Jupiter in the temple area. And from then on, every occupying country or empire will build in Jerusalem, build upon build upon build, and will build their buildings very often either literally or very adjacent to where the temple stood. So whether it is the Christians or the invading Muslims or the Crusaders or the Ottomans, there will be a constant change, but the symbolism will be the grand religious structure that stands there. Not the palace, not the fortress, but the religious structure. Now, one of the outcomes of being scattered is that the Jews will now be making use of the oral law. There was always an accompanying oral law, but the oral law was oral. It now has to be written down. Why? Because we need a portable Torah. We need something to take wherever we are scattered. And therefore the Mishnah comes into being within a century of the temple being destroyed, because that means you can now take Torah with you to wherever you are, along, of course, with the Torah scroll. But this will now be committed to writing as a result of the destruction, because you cannot meet in one centralized place. And eventually the Sanhedrin will also come to an end as a result of occupation, exile, and dispersion. So you therefore have a history of the fall of Jerusalem, which really stretches back to the Babylonian period and takes us through all the way to the Roman period, and took place for the second time some 2,000 years ago. Clearly, over the ages, Jews have been there. There was quite a community there during the 10th century and 11th century, before the Crusades destroyed all of Jewish life there. And then life started up in a very, very tiny way in the time of Nachmanides, when he was kicked out of Spain by the Dominicans, and in his 70s made his way to the land of Israel, built a synagogue there, the Ramban Synagogue. And although today there is the Ramban Synagogue in the old city, it's not located where the Ramban's shul actually was, but the two central pillars are pillars that do date back to the 1200s. He arrived there in 1267. And then during the 16th century, there was a further building up of Jerusalem. much more so towards the end of the 18th century by the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov and of the Vilna Gaon coming from Eastern Europe. And then there were the Aliyot, Aliyah Rishona and Shniya, taking place at the end of the 19th century, eventually giving us the Jerusalem that we are familiar with today. So Jerusalem has been somewhat rebuilt, and it's interesting, and I'll close with this. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Jerusalem has been rebuilt to an extent that even halachically we recognize it, meaning as follows. When the temple was destroyed, a halacha came into being that if one sees the place where Jerusalem once stood, one should tear one's clothing as a mourner would. And then one sees the temple area, you tear your clothing again. Nowadays, the halacha is that you do not tear your clothing over seeing Jerusalem, even though there are, parties that control areas of it. I'm sure you're aware that if you take a tour of the Temple Mount, which in itself is a halachic issue in its own right, but for people who take a tour of the Temple Mount, they are not allowed to pray at all on the Temple Mount. If they do, they get arrested. This is not an exaggeration. This is not sort of a political broadcast on some sort of far right-wing party. You look it up on the internet, you'll find that this is forbidden. It's forbidden for the Jews to pray on the Temple Mount. So even though Jerusalem may be under the ownership of the state of Israel and the land of Israel, it's not completely ours. But nevertheless, we no longer tear as a sign of mourning over seeing Jerusalem, because we consider in many ways Jerusalem to be rebuilt. This is in contrast to obviously the temple. When one sees the temple area, one tears clothing to denote the destruction, which is obviously particularly pertinent to this moment in time, over the fact that eventually not one but two temples would be destroyed on that same day of the 9th of Av. Okay.
Wow, Rabbi Hirsch. Before we close, if there's any burning questions that anyone has on anything that you've covered, we probably need another 9 hours to answer those questions. But if anyone, Rabbi Nick, are people able to unmute themselves, or do we have to unmute them? Yes. Okay, I think people are able to unmute themselves. If anyone has a quick question before we close, I'm waiting for. I actually can't see the group. Okay, fine. Well, listen, you started at Rabbi Hersh. You started off by saying that you're not sure that you've been invited back. I can tell you now that most certainly you are being invited back, because I think that I did in Belmont was around the 3 weeks with you in our shul, and I'm sure, and I know that you've been to Belmont, Bushy, and Stanmore in the last few years. So you've definitely been invited back. And I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, but you just spoke for over an hour, gave us an incredible overview of Jewish history, Jewish history, Israel, Jerusalem, without a single note. And the level of detail that you went through, it's just immense. And I'm in awe of your knowledge. What you don't know, it's not worth knowing. And really, and I mean that very, very sincerely on behalf of all of us, we really appreciate you spending an hour with us, giving us your time, letting us into your incredible encyclopedia of a mind, and making it alive. And I really feel, like I'm sure everyone here, that we just went through a journey with you, and we really appreciate that. So thank you very, very much. We look forward to inviting you back again, please God, in either together or in our own individual communities. And we hope that you also have a meaningful 3 weeks, and fast well. And thank you for joining us here in the Belmont Bushy Stanmore series. So thank you very much, Rabbi Hirsch. You are getting a very big round of applause right now, even though you probably can't see it, but we do appreciate that. And if I could just take another 10 seconds to plug the next 2 weeks. So we'll be meeting here, right on this very place, on the Bushy Zoom channel. We thought it would be easier, even though we're 3 communities, just to keep it the same channel, the same link for the 3 weeks. Next week, you're in for a treat because there's going to be an interaction between the rabbinic teams of Belmont Bushy and Stanmore as we reflect and look at Jerusalem, its past, its present, and its future. On a personal note, I was just thinking about it a minute ago, I've definitely interacted with all of the rabbinic teams myself in Jerusalem over the years that I was living there. So for the close to 7 years that I was there, I think I studied together in the same yeshiva for at least some point with Rabbi Nick. I know Rabbi Fein and I had many a Purim Seder and many a Shabbos together between the Ramat HaShkol where I lived and the Hanof where he lived. And we lived around the corner from the Feldmans in Ramat HaShkol for a period of time as well. So we interacted, and I'm sure we've got lots of stories to tell. So that's very exciting. We're really looking forward to doing that next week. And then the week after, which is getting much closer to Tisha B'Av, we're going to be joined by Rabbi Tzvi Shaloni, who is an incredible educator as well. And he is going to be taking us around the old city of Jerusalem, around the ruins, around the Kotel, around a lot of the places that we spoke about tonight as well. So we're really looking forward to this exciting program, not just the fact that we're joining together with other communities. The fact we've had over 100 people on tonight is amazing. And we hope that we are enhancing and inspiring and uplifting us through a difficult period in Jewish history, but hopefully something that we can all gain from, and it can help us to get the most out of this period of time. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to Bushy for hosting. Thank you once again to Rabbi Hirsch for your incredible share, and have a wonderful evening. Please God, we should all fast well and easily and have a meaningful day tomorrow as well. So thank you very much, and good evening. Have a good evening.